What would you do if you were genuinely interested in intimacy and made the decision to remove the steam, but right now, your brother entered your room and discovered now that you're in the thick of the act, you will discover what I have done with my name. I'm 22 years old, Tiffany, and all of this occurred only a few weeks prior to my trip. Taking a fall break at home. To give some background, I hadn't been home for more than 2. I've been studying overseas for years. On a different continent, but ultimately when the stars aligned, I purchased a return ticket. With my parents, it was really emotional, just the overwhelming sense of home once more after a lengthy period, and then Jason's younger brother arrived, and we grew up together, so he was rather younger than her. Then I was as a gangly, ungainly child. He was essentially my shadow during our were younger and constantly following along, but now, when he entered, I hardly saw him. Knew him as the slender, bashful boy I used to know, who was now 6 feet, a guy with big shoulders like this peaceful assurance about him. He appeared like though he had just emerged from one of those Instagram pictures of glow-ups or anything similar in a snug black shirt. I gave him a hug, and I was able to sense the muscle in his eye. Remarked back, "It was unbelievable that you grew up," withdrawing in real surprise. He scratched the back of his neck while laughing. "Yes, it does happen, but it wasn't only how I don't know, but he looked and smelled fantastic." Not sure if it was him or the cologne, but I was unprepared for the remainder of. I kept catching myself that night observing him and finding nothing. His laugh was something I had never experienced before. There was a serene intensity in his gaze that went deeper. Was similar to meeting a new person, although I've known him my entire life. Okay, let me simply get to the point that after all of the hugs, the first night back as I catch up, I stuffed my face with when I saw my mom's legendary lasagna. I was utterly exhausted after more than 18 hours of travel because delays and layovers had depleted all of your energy for me, so once everyone said goodnight, so I left. Up to having a shower and simply collapsing in my old room, and this is what the room was essentially unchanged from what parts of it had been turned by my parents into a visitor room, but they abandoned everything, my bookcase brimming with my novels and my posters as well as some of my high school materials. Lying about it felt like entering I was struck with nostalgia for time capsules, yet to be honest, I just wanted to crawl into bed and collapsed, so I showered. Allowing the hot water to remove the stiffness that came from flying. Amazing, similar to the first actual moment of after I finished, I felt the calmest I had in weeks. Put on a large t-shirt with the buttons off the lights and slipped beneath the covers. It was chilly, comfortable, and very quiet in my room. A silence that only you can. I don't think your childhood house can provide you with. Determine if the jet lag or the stress of school disappearing, or perhaps the manner Jason had returned to my life. Appearing as though it were, but my thoughts as I lay there in the dark began to stray, and to be honest, I hadn't experienced any sort of closeness for a very long period between academic work and everyday life. To be honest, I hadn't had the time or the drive to establish a connection with anyone in that manner, so I thought I'd take I had little time for myself. By itself, the house was quiet, and it simply seemed like the ideal time to unwind. I let my hands roam while I closed my eyes, simply rubbing them onto my skin to begin. The feeling was gentle and reassuring, similar to a method of getting back in touch with myself. My lips and neck were touched by fingertips. Then I sensed this inward warmth growing. However, my thoughts deceived me since, suddenly, Jason's face appeared. It didn't seem like I had planned it, in my opinion. However, his angular jawline was visible. His hair appeared a little untidy, that I sensed his peaceful assurance now. Tremendous warmth in my chest, followed by a decrease blazing like a wildfire through me. I told myself that I attempted to shake it off. My head was basically acting strangely because years have passed since I last saw him, but the idea persisted, and the more I attempted to push it away, and as it grew stronger, I continued to seeing how different he appeared now. What is the deep laugh that has this edge? I imagined how he gave me a hug. How firm he felt beneath my hands earlier, and I quit attempting to do so before I realized resist the idea I allowed to in. I ran my fingers down, allowing me to lose myself in the warmth that was increasing. My respiration began to shift quickly and superficially as I delved further into the moment. The space felt even more subdued than the rest of the world. has disappeared, save for this and me. Strong emotion developing within me, and then Jason appeared in my thoughts once more. I didn't try to stop it this time. Pictured his hands as firm and powerful. His voice was low as it brushed against my flesh. When making fun of my name, it seemed like vivid as though he were with me, and I unable to resist giving in to the fantasy. My body responded right away to the way my body stretched as my fingers worked. All of my body's nerves felt electrified. Was alive, and the warmth I had previously experienced became something I was unable to ignore. It was the ideal balance of coziness and thrill, similar to what I was feeling, something fresh, yet concurrently, and to put it simply, it wasn't only physical. It had a certain level of emotional intensity. Additionally, it might have been the fact that Jason had played a significant role in my life's development. Or perhaps the surprise of seeing him once more after searching for a long time and behaving as though nothing had happened regardless of the individual. It felt strong. I really surrendered and let myself go. Until my hands began to move with additional self-assurance, and my breathing became labored. My mental picture of Jason got more distinct. His lips grazing my waist, his hands there against my ear, that was definitely prohibited. In other words, this was Jason, the child I once when I was 14, I babysat, but that's what made it feel even more intense. Incorrect, yet simultaneously it seemed like I couldn't help but think about it. His eyes crinkled as he laughed. Everything returned in a flash when he grinned. To me, but this was added on top of it. Fresh attraction for which I was unsure on how to cle, the only light in the dim chamber emanating from the street's dim illumination. The air felt like a lamp outside my window. Dense, nearly electric, as I allowed my every touch sent thoughts to spiral further. I get chills every time I think about. My heart raced because of him, but merely since I was totally absorbed in the situation. Something in me paused, just a little. A voice murmured in the back of my head. Jason, what are you doing? It was as refreshing as a blast of cold water, and I stopped for a second and opened my eyes. Looking at the ceiling and attempting to create comprehension of my emotions, but then as soon as the hesitation appeared, it vanished. It was only a fantasy, I assured myself. A method to relax following a demanding day, no cause no harm, so I shut my eyes. Allowing myself to relapse into that, my fingers glided in a warm electric haze with a goal now, and I let the imagination to this time. There was nothing at all. Hesitancy, just the sound of my inhaling the comforting warmth of the blankets surrounding me, and Jason's vivid image. I visualized everything in my head, the way he would feel, warm and large hands, yet with the coarseness that results when someone works out a lot, and I considered his screaming out my name in a low, playful voice that would give me shivers in this manner. I couldn't understand his eyes and spine, guy. I couldn't get his eyes out of my head. They were this combination of calm and mischievous, like he always kept a secret from others. And it felt prohibited to do that. As though I had crossed an invisible boundary. However, that only intensified the body was completely in sync with the situation. I was having trouble breathing, and I was so nearly, and then it occurred completely unexpectedly. My room's door suddenly sprang open. Knock without any prior notice, just this thunderous crash of Tiffany, the door slammed into the wall. Jason's voice pierced the atmosphere like a slap, made me freeze completely. My brain short-circuited as my body tightened. And I was simply resting like a deer. Jason was in headlights, and my goodness, he stood there, and his eyes widened. Plates as he became aware of what he'd entered. The quiet was so loud that I could glimpse his brain at that very time. Become aware of what was going on, and his face became crimson red, and his jaw fell. And he simply stood motionless. He was frozen and didn't even attempt to turn away. He was only slightly looking into his mouth. Open as if his whole system had failed. And I remained there, lying like an idiot who was fully exposed, not physically but emotionally, which felt even worse. I was unable to speak or move. My brain seemed unwilling to process the circumstance. At last, following what seemed to the wheels in my head began to turn for eternity. Jason, I'm turning around again. What the hell, I yelled, making my voice much louder. More than I had planned, but he quickly stopped blinking quickly, I didn't recognize you. He retaliated, never lock your door, rising and reaching for a pillow to hide himself despite the fact that I was my heart was raised in clothing that wasn't Jason's face was no longer in a positive way. Still really red, but after that he grinned, a tiny grin nestled at the corner of his mouth, and I firmly believe that I desired, you might want to throw something at him. He said to hang a sign or something. Using his hands to back out of the room up as if he were giving up, merely stating, afterward, the small fool laughed like a chuckle out loud as if he hadn't just entered during the most awkward. He shut the door at a pivotal period in my life. I could hear him racing behind him down the steps while continuing to chuckle. I just sat there all by myself. Shocked, my heart was burning, and my face was pounding, and I had the need to enter a hole and remain there forever, but then, this is the unexpected part. Even I recognized that the entire had I'm not sure impacted me in a manner that wasn't anticipating since I sat there. I couldn't recreate what had just transpired. Forget about the expression on his face. When his eyes became big and he froze, it burned throughout my mouth as his mouth opened. Recollection, and rather than feeling ashamed, he seemed to see me, because I felt this strange spark. Not only in terms of outward appearance, but also in this moment of vulnerability, unvarnished, and as much that turned me on, even though I didn't want to admit it. Even worse, the humiliation was still yes, but it was combined with this electric rush I couldn't get rid of. The thought kept returning to him standing in the way. He looked in the doorway, changed from astonishment to amusement. As though our tension had reached a boiling point, and there was no turning back now. I tried to push it away so I could concentrate on literally anything else, but it was the picture of him standing there is pointless. Was burned into my mind each time. When I considered it, that spark turned. I spent the following day in a full-on fire. A few hours simply walking about my space attempting to relax and make sense of how I was feeling, but the more I considered it, the more I understood that there was a change, but this wasn't. It was no longer just about attraction. Jason, the child I grew up with, about him, the man who used to irritate the shit out of I hadn't seen the friend in years. I desired him, and I couldn't deny it any longer. And not merely in a vague fantasy how I want him throughout the following day. Couldn't stop contemplating what occurred, as though whatever I did, I wasn't merely considering the no longer embarrassed, it was ecstatic. Alternatively, Jason was behaving as if nothing had occurred. He was completely typical joke-telling during breakfast, using his phone to browse, while my mother discussed a new dish she was interested in. It was like the whole thing to try it. Didn't even bother him, but I was unable to make eye contact when sitting there. As if I were about to. I avoided combat for the majority of the day. Which was difficult for him in a home that little. I did my mom's laundry. Retrieved a few emails and attempted to divert my attention by reading a book I'd been intending to finish, but whatever I did, my thoughts keep returning to him. Afterward, my dad called late in the afternoon. He and my mother led me into the living room. Were seated on the couch and appeared to be they were going to release some sort of news. My dad and I are leaving tonight. Stated that your grandparents require assistance. We're heading over with a couple of things. We'll likely remain late there, but we'll return early in the morning. We'll tomorrow properly celebrate your return. All right, I nodded while attempting to be normal. Even though my heart was instantly pounding. Jason was seated across from him on the floor. Looking through a magazine in the room, Jason's father cried out to him, "Next, you're in command while we're away, okay?" Jason looked, "Don't burn the house down," up and smiled, saying, "I'll try, but no promises." My mother chuckled, and they began to seize their belongings to leave in 10 minutes. The home was once more silent. Jason and I initially attempted to. I remained in my room and played it cool. Looking through my phone and acting as though I wasn't acutely aware of each. He made a sound, and I could hear him moving. Below, the sound of plates clinking as he reached into the kitchen and took something. The TV's gentle hum while he relaxed into seeing a video, but the longer I sat the more restless I felt there. The previous night's events were still vivid and my body and mind were essentially humming with anxiety, and to be honest, I desired more. It seemed like some sort of the switch in me had flipped. And I wasn't considering if it was a bad decision considering the potential outcomes if things got weird, but I just knew I wanted him. And I refused to let myself. I waited until it was time to stop overanalyzing. Became dark, the home was silent, but for the TV downstairs suddenly made a faint sound. When I was at my breaking point, my strategy was to sneak out of my room and padded toward Jason's room, down the hallway. The door was open a little, and as I looked I saw him quickly lying on his bed inside. He was sleeping with his back to his side. The door, with one arm nestled behind his pillow. I paused for a moment because my heart was thumping so intensely that I feared it could awaken him up, but as I remained there, the more I experienced the rush of bravery, or perhaps my carelessness took control, and I slipped inside and silently shut the door. The chamber behind me was dimly illuminated, just by his desk lamp's brightness allowed me to hear a breathing steadily and slowly, and it created my own breathing heavily. I cautiously ascended onto the bed and rested my body beside him. Was almost trembling with anxiety. However, I couldn't help but mirror posture while he lies on my side, with my back to him in a position where I could sense the warmth that emanates from his body. I lay there for a while, simply letting the calm as the stress increases. Stillness was consuming my thoughts. Was accelerating, although my body was aware of. I just wanted to start moving. Bringing my hand a little closer to him touched his, causing him to stir. He slept a little, but didn't wake up. Even though my heart was in my throat, I continued to proceeding, after which he rolled his eyes. Opened slowly while blinking in an attempt to comprehend what was taking place. When his expression changed from sleepy to Tiffany, I'm confused and shocked. What are his voice was gritty. When you did it? I didn't say anything because I was sleeping. I simply reached out and grabbed his at first. Putting his hand against my waist, his hand felt warm and powerful, and for a moment he simply halted, gazing at me as if he couldn't comprehend what was taking place. It's your fault, I murmured in a scarcely audible voice. More than a murmur for entering he stared at me without knocking. His face was a mixture of bewilderment and something else that I was unable to quite area, but gradually he calmed down. His hand glided on its own by my side, and I witnessed the instant he surrendered. For a second, everything seemed. Jason's hand hovered over me in a weird way. Uncertain and unsteady, even I could sense the hesitancy in his contact, the type of anxiety that arises when someone's entering a completely unexplored territory. His palm was lightly resting on his at first, my fingers trembled a little. Wasn't even certain that he would go. After finishing it, he gave me a look that this mixture of bewilderment, dread, and interest. The wheels were whirling in his likely questioning if he should lean into whatever it is, or laugh it off. To be honest, I could hardly handle this. Maintain my composure, yet something. I moved and discreetly nodded to him, letting him know that it was acceptable for me to that he didn't have to give it too much thought. That small measure of comfort seems to be all he required, and his hands began to proceed cautiously at first, like he did. Trying things out, his fingers touched my warm side and reluctant yet firm. I could see that his expression was confused, yet there was additionally, he was determined to do this correct, even though he wasn't really sure what he was doing. In some way, made it more forcefully, his hand brushed against my skin, and I was unable to avoid shakily exhaled, realizing that it wasn't simply the bodily feeling was the manner in which he was working so hard on it, that how he was obviously attempting to read me to determine what was enjoyable and what wasn't. There something so unadulterated. I kept my hand on it because I felt vulnerable. The sensation of the rise and fall of his chest, his breath warmed his flesh beneath my palm, and I detected the subtle texture. There was a lot of muscle under his chest. Substantial, and I was unable to ignore that he had light veins along his arms. Even in the faint light, Jason's anxiety began to subside as he dug further. His actions got increasingly more self-assured and thoughtful. He wasn't just he was paying now that he was fumbling around. Paying attention to my responses and adapting appropriately and truthfully, he was performing admirably. I was unable to assist but maintain a small smile despite my stiff physique. With eagerness, there was something so charming about his demeanor approaching this as though he were learning something quite different, but he was putting all of his heart into it. Wasn't flawless naturally, there were times when where he paused, inexperience was evident. Or made a small mistake, but the effort he was obviously putting in, the way he was committed to ensuring a positive experience, it made up for everything for us both. And it was too much for me, and every sensation seemed amplified in the greatest way. Like though my whole body was focused on him. The air seemed heavier, the room felt hotter, and this electric current was palpable to me. Sprinting between us, it exceeded my expectations by a huge margin. Was more powerful than anything I had ever experienced. Over time, Jason's self-assurance increased. Every second that goes by, his movements becoming more fluent and certain that I could see the way his fear has changed in him began to dissolve away and was replaced with something more daring, and I was completely engrossed in this situation, as it seemed everything else vanished, including discomfort, hesitancy, and fear of what this could signify in its entirety vanished. He was the only thing that mattered. And the relationship we were establishing, the how both of us were totally present throughout this a split second, after which that rush of intense emotion that swept me away, it was 5 times more powerful and breathless. Greater than anything I have previously encountered, perhaps because it was more than just physical, was very sentimental, as evidenced by the way he gazed at me with such clarity. Attempting the steps we were both taking, becoming something entirely different together, I gave my forehead a shaky laugh. Leaning on his, "You're more adept at greater than I believed," I had gently teased he smiled in a voice almost audible above a whisper. A wave of relaxation and pride pouring over. I didn't believe I'd make it through this. His face, he acknowledged that his voice was as quiet as we both laughed at our conflict. Melting into a warmer substance, something more light, and at that very moment, I understood that this went beyond what had occurred. It concerned him as though I leaned in on instinct. It wasn't the grand dramatic action was slow and subtle. Wished to give him an opportunity to retreat if he had to, but he chose not to look, only flicked down to my lips. Our lips meeting was the encouragement I needed. Gently at first, nearly putting the water was shockingly warm. Gentle, and he was hesitant to his kiss, as though he wasn't sure if this was actually taking place. However, as the seconds passed, he tilted as his hesitation began to fade. His head pressed into the kiss just a little. With a bit more self-assurance, and I experienced the recognizable surge of heat. I'm not sure what it was that went through me. Regarding Jason, perhaps it was the reality that this was so unexpected and unlawful, but at that time, everything about him was driving me crazy. I sensed his lack of experience in kissing me, the how he was obviously working it out as he went, but that just improved it. I choose to take something more sincere. Control. I softly pushed him back while directing him till he was on the couch, flat. His eyes briefly widened, but I climbed on top of him without resistance. Balancing his waist, and I was powerless to stop, but grinned when he glanced up at me. Half anxious, half in awe, as he couldn't accept that this was actually happening. "Calm down," I whispered as I ran down his chest with his hands. His shirt was a little ridden up, exposing the small portion of Tun's flesh, and I followed the thin line of his abs. Feeling the way with fingers along that line, my contact caused his muscles to stiffen. Began to speak, but I interrupted him, sending off with a deeper kiss. More intense, and I sensed his relaxation. His hands were moving hesitantly beneath me. The kiss deepened as it rested on my hips. My fingers are more fervent and hungry. His hair was tangled, tugging a little, and I could feel his hands trembling beneath me. Stretched around my hips, and for a brief moment I pondered whether he would eventually take charge, but instead he simply gazed up at me, totally absorbed in the present, letting me take the lead, which I really enjoyed. Something about it seemed so empowering. Being in charge of providing direction him through this ordeal and observing his breath caught in his response. Each time I moved, each time I trailed my fingers or changed my weight. It was intoxicating as it ran along his skin. Being aware that I affected him in this way, he seemed to get a little push from that. Of assurance when his hands began to explore more freely. I could sense the shift in him from how he was at last. He is beginning to relax and simply savor the present, which for me was amazing with each kiss and touch. Every tiny motion felt increased intensity. I'm not sure if the forbidden aspect of it was the adrenaline or just because it was. I felt like I was on fire, though. Our kisses became more intense. I could sense his heartbeat in desperation. His chest rose against mine, and plummeting quickly as we became disoriented in each, I ran my fingers along his arms. sensing the power within them in the manner that as I wanted the muscles to flex when I touched them. Him a lot, but this complete nerd lacked defense, and at that time I didn't dare, and you know that, so I sat on my knees and crawled down to his feet. And carried out my actions. Alright, here's a updated version that keeps a courteous and secure tone while still expressing the closeness of the manner as events transpired. It seemed like a dance. That was new and different for both of us while I changed positions, observed his body's reaction, almost as if he was going through some type of for the first time there was a connection. This combination of interest and reluctance in the manner in which he moved, but also an indisputable feeling of vulnerability, I moved downward and knelt next to him without hurry. However, because I wanted to confirm that he felt at ease with every aspect of the moment seemed to be taking place in slow pace while maintaining trust between us, there were no expectations, only the knowledge that we were investigating this moment. Feeling each other out jointly, his response, both emotionally and literally appeared sincere, a little anxious, but also clearly invested in the experience. Claimed he has never experienced this before, and I appreciated that I didn't just push him. Let the situation develop organically. Without any side pressure in these types of situations when the physical component is just a little portion of it, what actually I found our communication to be really noteworthy. By our deeds to guarantee that there was constantly considerate of others' limits and mutual comprehension. When everything was over, I stood motionless, a little stunned, and I asked without thinking as I turned to face Jason. He didn't avert his gaze. So are you a virgin? Simply looked into my eyes and stated, no, in a voice stable, but there was a certain aspect of the way he phrased it caused me to pause. I continued looking at him, and he was nearly waiting. And he said, okay, you got me. I didn't really comprehend what he said, sis. First intended to be too entangled in my own. When I left the room, I thought about everything. Began to strike me suddenly, like a sluggish understanding of what had just transpired. I felt this whirlpool of mixed feelings about bewilderment, guilt, or even shame. It was quite hectic, but it was also alive with such intensity that, in a sense, I having never had any prior experience, not even with the most amazing people I've ever met, I couldn't get rid of the idea that perhaps I should not have done that. Perhaps I went above what I should have, but then I kept mentally reliving the scenes. Yet the sensation was different from I couldn't overlook anything else. Either the sensation that something was absolutely correct at the time, even though after that, I felt nauseous for what I did to Jason, but concurrently I couldn't dispute how excellent it was. Alright, was it correct? I'm not sure. Sincerely, I'm still trying to figure things out. But how should I feel, in your opinion? If you're guilty, please share in the comments what you consider all of this.